Hi, I'm Kathy Smith, and Happy New Year. Now, this will be the first time in 2023 that I'd like to welcome you to On Health Art of Living, where I bring you the latest information on how to live a healthier, more vibrant, more passion-driven life. So this year, it's my resolution to stop eating so much sugar and overly processed foods. And I want to invite you to join me on the journey. Once you listen to this powerful podcast, you're going to understand why it could be the most important resolution that you ever make. So I know most of you aren't eating Snicker bars and Cocoa Puffs, but chances are you might be eating lots of processed foods with added sugars. Taming your sugar habit and reducing the intake of processed sugars can help you lose weight and maintain that weight loss. But most importantly, it impacts your metabolic health. So today we're going to learn about the 8 pathologies that underlie all chronic conditions. All of them are nutrient sensing. And what does that mean? Well, basically means that they respond positively or negatively to specific components in food. Our guest today is New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Robert Lustig. I love this guy. He's just a dynamo. You're going to love when you hear his information that comes from his new book, Metabolical, where he takes a deep dive into what's fueling the continual increase of lifestyle diseases. Now, by now, you can name most of these diseases by heart. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, dementia, cancer, and the list goes on. But one of those defining messages is that these lifestyle diseases aren't druggable, but they are foodable. And you're going to find out exactly what that means in today's podcast. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. He's got some interesting concepts he's going to present. And I have a feeling that after today's show, your food choices you're going to be making better selections in your food choices from this day forward. So, Robert, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Kathy. It's my pleasure.
So just before we dive in a little bit, 1973, I graduated from college, and I was dating a doctor at the time. And there's a lot of talk, there's a buzz about orthomolecular, type of, approach to medicine. And we went back to Princeton. There was something like right around 73, where they had the Brain Bio Institute. And we went back there to just meet with a few doctors. And that was my first, foray into, vitamins, food can have an impact on your health. Do you ever remember the Brain Bio Institute?
I do, and there is an International Society of Orthomolecular Medicine. It's out of Canada. I've spoken at that in the past, and they are very much into this question of what's gone wrong. And the fact is, there are a lot of different people who are nibbling around the edges. What I try to do in my book, Metabolical, is basically stop nibbling and just take a really, really big bite and try to, fix it, solve it. The problem is it doesn't have a resolution. What it has is a prevention. And we Americans are not particularly good at preventing stuff, as you've seen, as we're seeing, now. That's not what we
harder.
do.
It can be harder if there's a lot of confusing information going around, but it takes a little bit more emphasis on what the individual needs to do.
There are a lot of dark forces working to keep us very sick. I've published on that. We've, here at UCSF, we've actually, unearthed some of the documents that have shown what's gone on, the dark underbelly of the food industry, to actually keep us fat, sick, and stupid. We're trying to, shall we say, undo that. But what we've learned is that there's no pill for this. And the reason there's no pill for this is because the pill can't get where the problem is. And so that begs the question, okay, where's the problem? And I can sum that up in one word. The problem's in the mitochondria. Now, What's a mitochondria, you ask?
Being that I'm in the exercise field, I
Okay,
talk about the mitochondria, but that's great. I mean, because
right,
mitochondria, energy,
right.
that
Right. The mitochondria, for your listeners, are the little energy burning factories inside each cell that actually take the energy substrate and turn it into chemical energy that your then cells can use to power them to stay alive, to do the processes they need to do. That is the whole concept of metabolism, taking foods and then turning them into either building blocks for growth or substrate for energy burning. Well, the mitochondria are in charge of the energy burning. The problem is that there's no medicine that can get to the mitochondria. They're inside cells, you can't get there. And so that actually then begs the question of what is nutrition? So to answer that question, I'm going to throw two other terms in: food science, metabolic health. So food science is what happens to food between the ground and the mouth. Nutrition is what happens to food between the mouth and the cell. Metabolic health is what happens inside the cell. The problem is that all of the diseases that we are dealing with, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease, these are all inside the cell. So nutrition is only valuable as it informs metabolic health. And we are not fixing metabolic health. We're actually only making it worse. And the reason is because we can't get to the mitochondria.
So, as you're talking about this, you think about how we've been educated through the years, and that has always been about the calories in versus calories out. And
Right.
even in fitness, we would teach eat fewer calories, exercise a little bit more, you'll lose weight. And then all of a sudden, this
Right.
wasn't happening. But then what was interesting, the experts, the doctors, including yourself, which you admit in your book, were going down this path. And then, and then the research shifted, and especially with your
Yeah.
research, and it shifted into, which I love this, not all calories are created equal. So can you just like dive into that, and what prompted you to change your mind about this calories in, calories out? And then working back to what's on that box cover, that's all
Right.
we're ever looking at. We're only ever looking at, oh, this has 180 calories in a cup.
Right.
And but it's not telling the whole story. As a matter
No,
of fact,
it's not telling any story.
okay.
It's telling a mythology is what it is. It's not telling any true story. My job is to kill the calorie. I want it gone as a unit of measure because it is absolutely completely useless. Okay, and it's only gotten us into more and more trouble. So how come, what, why this, change, this 180-degree shift in this whole concept of dietary advice? The people who studied obesity before World War II knew that the problem of obesity was a problem of energy storage. They had just discovered the relationship between the brain and the pancreas in terms of insulin release. They had discovered cortisol, the stress hormone, and how it puts on visceral fat in the belly, a process called Cushing syndrome. And so they were very, very attuned to the idea that they were things that made you gain weight. They were things that caused energy storage. And then World War II happened, and the entire concept shifted. And at that point, then the psychiatrists got involved, and they started talking about the fact that, oh, yes, that we had this thing called stress eating, and people were basically eating more in response to stress. And so they ended up noticing that people who were obese exercised less, which was true. But so they then decided that this was really not a problem of energy storage. They decided this was a problem of energy balance. Okay, that it was a question of what you eat versus what you burn. Okay. Well, somehow that took hold, and I know how, but it would take too long to explain. But that's where the calorie came in, because the calorie was the unit of measure that went across both the eating and the burning. And so calories came to dominate the whole landscape of obesity research throughout the entire last half of the 20th century. And so everybody kept saying, eat less, exercise more, eat less, exercise more. Guess what? We ate less, we exercised more, and we only gained more weight. And that was, of course, the problem. Now, I was raised in this. I graduated medical school in 1980. I got all of this, from the gurus in med school. But I had also actually studied nutrition in college, graduating in 1976. And I learned that different foods were metabolized differently. All right. And I learned that from some very heavy hitters in the nutrition field at MIT. Well, then I went to medical school and they beat it out of me and said, none of that matters. It's just what the patient eats and what the patient burns. And, therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault. And that's what they practiced. And that's what they taught me to do too. Well, in 1995, I moved to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a pediatric cancer hospital. And we had a lot of kids who'd survived their brain tumors, only to become massively obese in the process. Now, this damage of an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which controls weight, this form of obesity was called hypothalamic obesity because basically we're damaging the hypothalamus. And for that reason, for some reason, you basically exploded in terms of weight gain. And I had about 40 of these kids that I had to take care of. And the parents would come to me and say, this is double jeopardy. My kids survived the tumor only to succumb to the therapy. And so it behooved me to try to do something about it. Now, there was a animal model of this where you put a electrode in a rat's hypothalamus and you buzz it, and all of a sudden now that animal becomes massively obese. Well, the reason they became massively obese was because they started putting out insulin, the hormone insulin, hand over fist. Now, insulin is known as the diabetes hormone, but it's also the energy storage hormone. So insulin shunts energy to fat cells for storage. That's its job. Well, these animals were putting out insulin hand over fist, but you could stop it by cutting the nerve that went from the brain to the pancreas. And then the insulin wouldn't be released and the animal wouldn't gain weight. So that told me that insulin was the bad guy in this story. So we did a study where we gave a medicine to these kids with this disorder, hypothalamic obesity, where we suppressed insulin release. And lo and behold, these kids started losing weight. They could only gain weight before. And now they started losing weight. But more importantly, they started exercising spontaneously. I didn't tell them to go exercise. They started exercising. One kid became a competitive swimmer. Two kids started lifting weights at home. One kid became the manager of his high school basketball team, running around collecting all the basketballs. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept because their bodies, because they were releasing so much insulin, they would rather store it than burn it. And now, because of the medicine, they were burning it. And so they felt better. It changed their quality of life. We ended up doing this study 4 different ways in 4 different directions in both adults and children, and the same thing came out. When you get the insulin down, not only do people reduce their food intake, but they actually increase their physical activity, their energy expenditure. And what this showed us was that, in fact, the 2 behaviors that we associate with obesity, gluttony and sloth, they're really just symptoms. They're manifestations of the primary process of energy storage. Remember, energy storage versus energy balance.
So let me be devil's advocate for a second here, or just backtrack. You gave them because I'm sure everybody's listening going, oh my gosh,
What's that medicine?
they gave
Right.
them a medicine. No, they
Right.
gave them a medicine
Yeah.
which dropped their insulin. What can I take that medicine? Or you know,
Well, in
that's part of
fact,
it, but also it gets back to the medicine helped them drop the insulin. So
that's
let's
right.
just unpack insulin a little bit, because
That's right.
typically, and I just went for my blood work recently, and so it's top of mind, but typically we look at, A1C and, your fasting glucose levels.
Right.
So
Not enough.
yeah, and so and I know your take on this, but explain it to the audience, because that's the one we all look
Right.
at. Are we pre-diabetes? Are we into metabolic syndrome? Are we okay? And there's a
Right.
point. And so kind of unpack that, because people are a little confused about it.
Right. So, and they're confused for good reasons. I admit that. So the question is, which comes first, the obesity or the insulin? And our research says the insulin comes first. In fact, insulin always comes first. Now, there are different insulin problems. Different people have different insulin problems and therefore have to be treated different ways. It's not like everyone's the same. This is the concept of personalized obesity medicine, which now is actually starting to take hold. And there are people actually doing this. There's a guy at Mayo Clinic who's doing this. There's University of Minnesota. There are several people who are on this concept now, that different foods affect insulin in different ways in different people. But there is no weight gain without insulin. Insulin is required for energy storage. Therefore, insulin is a primary target of obesity therapy.
So I just want to even stop you there, because even when you're talking about going to the different institutions that are dealing with individualized and personalized medicine. So and let's just like really break it down very simple. So you eat somebody eats oatmeal. One person eats oatmeal, two different people eat oatmeal.
Well, what kind of oatmeal?
The
It depends.
but let's just say it's a good, steel cut oats with some, but I had this one with some chia, some flax, some
Right.
hemp seeds on it, and
Yep.
little some walnuts sprinkled on there. Or let's do the sugary type, make
the
that more
donut.
sugary.
The donut, right.
Yeah, the donut. Yeah. Okay. So what happens? Goes into your system.
So if you consume 160 calories in steel cut oats, how many of those calories are you going to absorb? Probably only about 130. And the reason is because the fiber in the steel cut oats will actually inhibit absorption. The fiber in your food acts as a barrier for early absorption. So think of it like a fishnet, okay? The insoluble fiber, the cellulose, the stringy stuff in celery, okay, which is in the husk of the steel cut oats, forms a lattice work on the inside of your intestine, like a fishnet. And the soluble fiber, like the pectins and the inulin, they are globular. They plug the holes in the fishnet. So that together, those two, the soluble and the insoluble fiber, they form a secondary barrier on the inside of your duodenum, the first part of your intestine, and they prevent early absorption. Therefore, you don't get the big glucose rise. Therefore, you don't get the big insulin rise. Therefore, you're not going to shunt as much energy to fat. In addition, since you didn't absorb it early, it goes further down the intestine. And what's in the second part of the intestine that's not in the first part? The bacteria, the microbiome. They're going to chew that food up for their own purposes. So even though it passed your lips, it registered as a calorie consumed, it didn't register as a calorie absorbed because your microbiome chewed it up instead. So this whole thing about calories is ridiculous, is worthless, because if you ate the food with fiber, that food wasn't for you. It was for your bacteria. So you're measuring what happens here at your mouth. Who cares? Okay. What you really want to do is measure what comes in at the level of your intestine where the food gets absorbed. But we're not doing that. We don't even have a way of doing that. So, like, why bother with calories? That's another reason I want to kill the calorie, because that's irrelevant. Second reason to kill the calorie, it was oatmeal. That's glucose. It's basically a form of starch. Now, glucose raises insulin. No argument there. It does. But the donut, it didn't just have glucose. It had fructose too. Also had some fat, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Okay. It had fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar. And that sweet molecule is handled completely differently from that of glucose. The liver actually handles fructose, that sweet molecule, in the same way that the liver handles alcohol. Now, you would never give a kid a shot of bourbon, would you? But in fact, when you give your kid a donut, that's exactly what the liver is seeing. No difference. Shot of bourbon, donut. Which is okay?
Or apple
Neither.
juice, or apple juice,
Well,
which is more,
or
yeah,
apple juice,
yeah,
or orange juice, right?
which is kind of more common,
Right.
which is just like you're typically that's
Right.
being,
Well,
handed to your child all the time.
well,
Um,
take the national school breakfast program breakfast. A bowl of Fruit Loops and a glass of orange juice. That's 41 grams of sugar. Okay. That is 2 donuts. Okay. Or 2 shots of bourbon. Okay. Would you ever think of giving your kid 2 shots of bourbon on the way to school? Well, if you actually feed your kid the normal US kid breakfast, that's what you've done. So calories are not handled the same. A calorie is not a calorie. It's not a calorie because it might be for your bacteria, and it's not a calorie because if it got metabolized differently in your mitochondria, then it's going to have a different effect. So all of these things are important in terms of actually determining what constitutes appropriate metabolic health.
Well, it's interesting. On the show, had Dr. Will Bulsiewicz a couple times, a big gut doctor, Zach Bush. So we've talked a bit about the gut, a lot about the gut, and a lot about fiber. So I love that you're diving into that. I love the visual also with the fishnet. I've heard you talk about like a colander where you
Get a
put
colander, yeah.
Vaseline on. I like that also, that you're plugging up the holes. Makes perfect sense. But what I want to jump over to is that you have this in the book, you repeat it all the time. If there's, it's the 2 precepts. It's like, if there's anything you could talk to, if you could sum up your book, not that, people should definitely buy, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, the book, and to really understand the whole background and all this, because it's really, every page is fascinating. But your precepts are protect the liver, feed the gut. So protect the liver, feed the gut. So we talked about feeding the gut. Let's go to that first one, protect the liver, because I don't think it's an organ that most people kind of understand. I mean, you got heart, you think heart, intestines, kind of kidneys and pancreas a lot since we've been talking sugars, but the liver is a powerhouse organ. And I would love you to dive into it and kind of get into how exactly do we protect the liver then, and why is it so important?
Right. So the liver is it's your primary detoxification and metabolism organ. Okay. It is required. And if your liver's not working right, you're going to die, or you're going to need a liver transplant. And by the way, fatty liver disease is now the leading cause of liver transplant in the United States, having overtaken hepatitis C. 45% of Americans now have fatty liver disease.
Crazy.
And 25% of children have fatty liver disease. Now, prior to 1980, if you were diagnosed with fatty liver disease, that meant you were an alcoholic, period. Full stop. Okay. Fatty liver disease, alcohol. That's it. And then we started seeing people who did not consume alcohol, who had the same fatty liver disease, looked exactly the same under the microscope, and ended up causing the exact same diseases and causing the exact same problems, and people dying of it anyway, called non-alcoholic or metabolically active fatty liver disease. And then we started finding it in children. Okay. I remember the very first patient that I saw as a pediatrician with fatty liver disease in 1993. And I went, what the hell is this? I have never seen anything like this before. And then they all started coming. Okay. Just like the obese kids, they all started coming, and they, frequently were had the same problem. I mean, the fatty liver disease and the obesity, but every once in a while you saw a thin kid with fatty liver disease, and you saw plenty of obese kids who didn't. So it became very clear they overlapped, but they weren't exactly the same. So the question was, what was causing the fatty liver disease? And that's where this concept of alcohol and sugar came in. So in 2006, I was asked by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, part of the NIH, to come give a talk on what I thought was the biggest problem in terms of exposure that was causing metabolic syndrome in the world. And they probably figured I was going to come talk about phthalates or bisphenol A, or flame retardants, or chlorpyrifos in insecticides, or whatever, all of which are important, and all of which are what we now call obesogens, chemicals that actually cause weight gain because they bind to endocrine receptors and actually cause adipose tissue storage. Well, I thought I did a reverse engineering. I said, wait a second, what are the two diseases that kids now get that they never got before? Because kids are always the canaries in the coal mine. They're always the most vulnerable. I said, well, the two diseases that they never got before but now get are type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease. And so I opened up my biochemistry text. I said, well, those two diseases were the diseases of alcohol. So I went to the page on alcohol, and right across was the metabolism of fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar. And I traced them down, and I went, wait a second, they're exactly the same. And they knew this back in 1974, that they were exactly the same. And it was very different from that of glucose. So this whole concept of a calorie is a calorie, just was never true, but it was what the food industry said to make us think that they could add more sugar to all of our food and it would be fine because it was just calories. Garbage. Okay. And so then I started realizing, that this was actually a put-up job, that there was actually culpability here. And there was actually sort of the dark forces that were actually at work here to try to keep us fat, sick, and stupid. And so I started writing about this, and I went to that NIH meeting, and I said, I think it's sugar, and here's why. And I showed the two pathways of the alcohol and the fructose, and they mobbed me. At the end of the talk, they practically tackled me and said, oh my God, you're right. These are toxicologists. Fructose is a toxin. It's a chronic dose-dependent metabolic toxin, a liver toxin, because that's the liver's job, is to metabolize toxins, to get rid of toxins. Well, the dose determines the poison. And there is an upper dose for any toxin that you can't handle, that your liver basically has an upper limit. Well, our upper limit for fructose is a little higher than, say, our upper limit for cyanide, or our upper limit for, VX gas, or our upper limit for, benzene, or for, other toxins. But the fact of the matter is there's an upper limit. And when you exceed that upper limit, bad things happen.
So fructose. So clarify fructose for a second, because most people think fructose and they think fruit. Well, and yet, okay, fruit, strawberries, berries, good for you.
Well, right.
Too much, not.
That's right. So bottom line is, fruit is good and fruit juice is bad. And the reason is, number one, fruit has fiber. That fiber prevents the absorption. So a lot of the fructose in fruit never got into your bloodstream. It was inhibited from being absorbed by that fiber. And so the microbiome chewed it up instead. So that's good. In addition, how many oranges can you eat before you throw up? Answer, 4. How many glasses of orange juice can you drink before you throw up? Any amount. The fiber is
I want
self-limiting.
to know how you know about the 4 orange things, how that was
Oh,
tested.
because it's an experiment we do.
Oh,
My
is it?
colleague and my fellow cookbook co-author, Cindy Gershon in the East Bay, she is a nutrition educator at Mount Diablo High School,
Mhm.
and they have a culinary arts class, and she's in charge. And every year they start with the same experiment. First day of the class, she takes 2 kids from the class, both of which haven't eaten because these are poor, slow socioeconomic status kids for the most part. And she takes 2 kids from the class, and she hands each one 6 oranges. And she says to the first kid, "Here, kid, here's 6 oranges, make juice." So the kid squeezes the 6 oranges, gets 12 ounces, downs the whole thing, says, "Okay, what's for breakfast?" Second kid, she says, "Here, kid, here's 6 oranges. Eat the 6 oranges." Kid eats orange number 1. Kid eats orange number 2. Orange number 3. Gets to orange number 4 and throws up every single time on orange number 4. Cindy's got the vomit basin ready.
I hope these kids are volunteer and not chosen.
They volunteer. Yes,
They
they
volunteer.
volunteer.
Yeah. No,
They volunteer.
that's so no, but it is. I mean, okay, so you have the fiber with and off the fruit, but then the big thing that happened in our country was the high fructose corn syrup, right? Was that the other
Yeah,
thing that triggered
right.
so
So
much of this
right.
response?
So in 1966, a scientist in Japan figured out how to turn corn into high fructose corn syrup. It took a while for it to catch on here in America, probably into the late 70s before we started seeing any meaningful amount of it. But then came Hurricane Allen, which basically wiped out the Caribbean sugar crop in 1980. And all of the soft drink companies went scrambling. We don't have enough sugar because of what happened to the Caribbean. And so they realized they needed a homegrown source of sugar. And that's when high fructose corn syrup started being, made here on our shores because corn was unlimited. And by 1985, the industry had decided, yes, high fructose corn syrup is half the price. It is ubiquitous. It is easy to make. And so that was the switch from, remember, regular Coke to new Coke, 1985. Well, we rebelled. They went back to Coke Classic, and then they slipped it in surreptitiously and didn't tell anybody. And so now it's all new Coke, and they just didn't, advertise it. The point is that the fructose molecule in high fructose corn syrup is the same fructose molecule as in sugar. There's no difference between the 2 molecules. The difference is that high fructose corn syrup is half the price. And because it's half the price, and also because it's miscible, okay, it won't crystallize out because the glucose and the fructose are free. So they won't crystallize out like they do in, like cookies. Okay, so they stay soluble. So this ended up being a big boon for the processed food industry because they could put more sugar in and not have it crystallize out. And they realized that the more sugar they added, the more people bought because it's addictive. And so the molecule itself is the same, but high fructose corn syrup gave the food industry an extra advantage in terms of being able to apply more sugar into our diet, thus making us even sicker.
Well, besides the sugar, also, since you jumped on processed foods, and you talk about, it's a large part of what you're saying is causing so many problems is not just the sugars, but it's the processing. So this idea that food in itself is not good or bad, or, all food is good. It's what's
All
done to
food
the
is inherently
food.
good.
Yeah,
That's right.
but it's what's done to the food
That's right.
that causes the issues, and it's the processing. So how much, I mean, get into the processing thing because unless you're on the perimeter of the grocery store, everything in the aisles is somewhat processed to one degree or another. Is there a degree of processing? Is there something that you should look for? Like, definitely stay away from these kind of processed foods.
Right.
Or are you, it's a blanket statement that processing in itself, you should stay away from most processed foods.
Right. So this is actually a bone of contention right now throughout the entire world as we try to figure out how to modify the food system to make it healthier. So this is, right at the top of my, to-do pile, as it were. There is a classification system based on processing that was developed by my colleague, Dr. Carlos Monteiro at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And it is called the NOVA system, NOVA. And what it does is it takes the different foods and classifies them based on how processed they are rather than what's in them. An example would be start with an apple. So class 1 would be an apple. Class 2 would be apple slices that have been, say, destemmed, decored, deseeded. Class 3 would be applesauce, which had been macerated and preservatives added and possibly even added with sugar added. And class 4 would be a Hostess apple pie. Okay. The ultimate ultra processed, it would last 10 years and, basically, 50,000 ingredients and, didn't even resemble an apple anymore. All right. So those are the 4 classes within the NOVA system. And what Carlos has been able to show is that classes 1, 2, and 3 are not correlated with chronic disease. But class 4, that ultra processed food category, that's where all the disease is. Type 2 diabetes, heart disease, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, mortality, all of them related to that class 4 grouping. And he's got, epidemiologic data, and we've now demonstrated causative data for why that would be. So this is the reason why we think that it's the processing that matters. Now, what's being processed? Well, ultimately, the addition of sugar for palatability and the removal of fiber for shelf life. Now, there are also a lot of chemicals along the way, and a lot of them are not good for you, agreed. Okay, there's also farming practices in terms of, insecticides and glyphosate, Roundup, that is important in this as well. This is all part of processing as well. The processing can occur even before the wheat is harvested, and you've already got a problem. So there are a lot of different steps along the way in terms of what can go wrong. But ultimately, it's not the food. It's what's been done to the food that matters. And the 2 things that are the biggest are the addition of sugar and the removal of fiber. So when you go into the store, the question is, how do I purchase a low sugar, high fiber diet? And the answer is, if you've gone into the shelves, you've gone off the rails.
Off the rails.
It's just
that
that
makes, that's a good way to, again, visualize it. Off the rails. Now let's go, because I know we're running short on time, but let's go back to kind of how I introduced the whole topic today and introduced you and connect the dots here. So we have all these diseases, and let's use an example of, you go to the doctor and you're told, Miss Jones, you have hypertension, your blood pressure's too high. We're going to put you on a medication to bring that down. So if you could, I know it's a tough challenge, but if you could you take that and then bring it back to, maybe and tie it back to these one of these 8 pathologies or what's happening, and what would be what is actually happening besides, I mean, the pump saying, oh my God, it's 130 over 90 or whatever. It's, it's
Right,
above what it should be.
right.
But what got it there and what can be done about it besides taking the blood pressure, low blood, blood pressure lowering medication?
Okay, perfect example. Everyone thinks that the reason for high blood pressure is because of salt. Well, we've taken our salt levels down from 15 grams per day. Our ancestors consumed 15 grams a day of salt and did not have hypertension. And now we consume 6.9 grams per day. So we've cut our salt consumption by 60%, but our blood pressure's gone up, not down, because it's not the salt. Okay. We thought it was the salt. It's not the salt. Here's why. There's something that causes your kidney to hold on to sodium, and it's called insulin. The higher your insulin, the less well your kidney can excrete, remove the sodium. And so when your insulin's high, your blood pressure will be high because you can't get rid of the sodium and water stays with it. So therefore your blood pressure goes up. So you have to get your insulin down in order to get your blood pressure down. And getting rid of salt is not going to help you do that. In fact, getting rid of salt makes the food taste like, and so the food industry actually, makes all these low salt things. What do they do to cover up the fact that the food tastes like? They add sugar. Well, it turns out the sugar is what caused the insulin to go up. And so if you got rid of the sugar, the insulin would go down, you'd be able to excrete the sodium, and your blood pressure would go down. In addition, because sugar, when it's metabolized, releases a reactive oxygen species, an oxygen radical known as oxidative stress, you are actually doing damage to the inside of your artery. In addition, sugar causes an increase in a compound called uric acid, and uric acid raises your blood pressure too. So sugar, for 3 separate reasons, is the driver of both hypertension and the inflammation that ultimately leads to cardiovascular disease and stroke. So get rid of the sugar, get rid of the uric acid, get rid of this insulin, get rid of the sodium, bring your blood pressure down, and all of a sudden, guess what? You're healthy and you never needed to take that antihypertensive in the first place.
It's so easy to say, and as we know, so, so sometimes hard to do, like especially with sugar and processed foods. And I think this
Well,
is what we close on is it's addictive. I mean,
it's
stuff is
addictive.
addictive. So to
Sugar is
say
addictive.
it is so addictive. So even for myself, I have a very, whole food, diet that's based on perimeter all the way. And so except it's not even that big, except that, like sugar and like, I like there's something I'm eating now called Ocho bars, and it's chocolate, dark chocolate covered coconut. And I mean, but I can literally, I know that it's too much sugar for my system. And I sort of justify, well, I'm going to work out. And I love that. And I love that you put this in the book that exercise is also has its own magic for all of these cellular and subcellular pathologies you're talking about, but only for some of them. But you can't outrun a bad diet. So it doesn't matter
That's
how
right.
much you're going out there, how many exercise, how many push-ups, whatever. If certain things are off, then you're going to have those, you're going to get those blood results, and they're not going to look great. So for me, and so I'm kind of stating the obvious, but you make the point in the book, and I don't know if you make friends or enemies with this, but like who's to blame, but how to kind of in a sense, where are we pointing fingers? Is it the food industry? Is it government? Is it the medical community? Or is it me, myself, and I? Is it the personal responsibility?
Look, once upon a time, we did not have this problem. We have it now. Do you think that the entire world became gluttons and sloths in the span of 50 years in countries that are developing countries? I mean, how is that possible? Okay, you want to ascribe it to the individual? Then explain to me why we have an epidemic of obese newborns. They don't diet and exercise. You want to blame them? Okay, it's really easy to ascribe blame. Our entire society is about blaming someone else. Okay, it's our litigious society. Find someone else to blame. Okay, we're seeing that right now in terms of our two-party system. Everybody's blaming somebody else. The fact of the matter is, there is somebody to blame. Okay, and it's the food industry, because they're the ones who spiked the food. And that's what's causing the disease. The two phenomena that we associate with obesity, the two phenomena we associate with all these diseases, gluttony and sloth, are easily explained by insulin. Because when you drop the insulin, the gluttony and the sloth go away. We have shown that. So what's making the insulin go up? The sugar. The sugar is the payload. The ultra-processed food is the vehicle. Now, you could argue, well, we need processed food, because how are we going to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050 without it? And that's a good question. And it's one I'm very interested in trying to solve. But the fact of the matter is, we have to fix the food system. And until we fix the food system, we will not solve this problem. That I can absolutely 100% guarantee you. And we haven't fixed it yet. And until we do, we will not solve it.
Well, I think we can end on that, and basically also saying that as consumers, our pocketbooks and what we buy can determine some of this. I mean, because a lot of us feel like how can we impact anything? How can as a consumer I impact anything? But stop buying.
Well, you vote with your fork, and you vote 21 times a week. Okay, and the point is that if you don't purchase it, they won't provide it. But if it's addictive, what are you supposed to do?
Break the habit.
Well, you got to know. Knowledge is where you start. That's what we're doing now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Robert. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna do close it out, and I'll talk a little bit more once you jump off, but just can't encourage people enough to go out and buy Metabolical. Chapter by chapter, it's really well laid out, and it's so consumer friendly. So you get all the facts, but it's all in enough of layman's terms that everybody can understand it. And once you do, you're going to be going back through and rereading certain chapters. I know I did. So thank you again, Robert. Unbelievable what you're doing for the world, and I thank you.
It's my job. It's not. You don't have to thank me. We're just trying to fix a problem. That's all.
Wow, I could spend another hour with him just digging into all of this. It was such a pleasure having Dr. Robert Lustig on the show. And I followed him from afar for a long, long time, always admired him. It's quite amazing that after spending 25 years investigating the causes and treatments of chronic disease in children and adults, that his research can be summed up the way that he describes it in 3 simple precepts. It's about the insulin, it's about the sugar, and it's about the lack of fiber. All of this has led him to determine that processed food is a primary culprit, because processed foods are putting in the sugar and stripping out the fiber. And they're not going away no matter how much we want it. So, and that's partly because they're cheap, they're convenient, and they're addictive. So it really relies on the individual to start making better choices when we go into the supermarket. And to learn more about Robert, Dr. Lustig, and his book, Metabolical, all you have to do is visit his website, Robert Lustig, Lustig.com. While you're there, don't forget to check out his other book called Fat Chance. I hope you enjoyed the show today. I really love this one. Now, if you're getting bored during your workouts, but who could get bored working out, right? too much fun. But if you're getting bored of your songs, your music, or your audible books, or your audio books, then try listening to a few other podcasts. I love to go back and revisit some of the ones in the archives, or if you haven't listened to them already, they really can jumpstart your a healthy lifestyle, especially if you've had a lot of time where you've been feasting and celebrating and not really kind of focusing on your food or movement. This can be just what you need to get started again. If you're looking for motivation, you can jump into oh, who do I love? I love them all. But Dr. Patrick Porter, oh my gosh, he has quick ways of getting you to stop negative thinking and to just start moving again. If you want to know more about time restricted eating, then Felice Gersh really has a great episode on how is the best way to do it if you're a female, and how to do it so it doesn't impact your hormones, but it really does set you up for success. And then another great one is the beginning of the year is once again uh, Ageless Intensity with Pete McCall. How can you get moving and move in a way that's smarter, not longer? So it's not about going longer, but going smarter, and with certain techniques that he teaches. One thing that I can suggest that you might try is the Fit Over 40 program, which is absolutely free. It's a great way to start making small changes, taking small steps every day in your inbox. You will get an email with a workout that's anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And in that time, you might be doing Pilates, might be going out for a walk, might be doing some yoga, some strength training, and it all builds on top of each other. It's all very progressive. And by the end of the 14 days, you're going to start to feel the transformation happening. So check it out. Really easy. All you have to do is go to fitover40.com/fitover40. And it's a 40. Check that out. Well, lots to go on, lots of good fun today. Always enjoy being with you. Send me any topics. Go to Instagram and list any topics you might want to hear about this year. But until next time, here's to your health. Bye.